you for your attention, and certainly at the end during the Q&A session after the third presentation we could elaborate more on some of the elements which I have mentioned or which I have omitted to mention. Thank you, and now I would like to call upon Dr. Pete Jokich to give us now the same but from a different perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. I was initially very hesitant to accept Father's invitation to speak at today's fall seminar. First of all, I'm really not into public speaking very much, so that was the first reason. And second of all, because I really didn't think I'd have anything to say on this topic. So I was like, do I really want to do this? He goes, no, Pete, you really need to do this. But when Father told me that this was being put on in honor and memory of Father Dennis, I felt totally obligated to prepare some remarks today because he taught me so much every time he came here and spoke at our seminars. So that's really why I'm here, in memory and honor of Father Dennis. As many of you know, since I come to most of these seminars, I love to ask questions. So putting together this talk on identity really allowed me to ask many, many questions. Some of them may be controversial, which I love to have controversial questions, and I'll share these questions as we go along today. Unlike most speakers, I'm really going to give you my conclusions in the very beginning. So we're going to start with the conclusion. So my conclusion as a physician and as a scientist is that I believe that the source and origin of our true identity is a mystery, like most things in life. However, I think it really is a combination of several different things. First of all, what we've inherited from our ancestors through our genes, what we've been exposed to in our lives, and our innumerable life experiences, starting from the very minute of conception. Father talks about this a lot in his sermons, where the whole field of prenatal psychology is where we really start to develop our identity in utero. What is most important in shaping our identity, or what proportion of genes versus experiences versus memories contribute to our true identity? Really, it's a mystery. So I raised the first very interesting question. Since the Bible tells us, like Father said, that we're created in the image of God, was the divine nature somehow mysteriously embedded into our human genes? And therefore, God is truly the source and origin of our true identity. Is God truly our original Father, genetically, somehow in each of us? Is there such a thing as a God gene? Interesting and controversial question. So maybe we can stop right there. Those are my conclusions. I don't know anything else, so we could technically stop. But I have a lot of other questions that came up as I kind of researched this topic.
That's why I asked you to speak.
I kind of figured that. So first of all, how do we actually define the word identity using terms from psychology and from sociology? Or the question is, what is individual identity? So I'm going to read some definitions that I got from dictionaries and from various articles. So identity is the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. Identity is the distinguishing character or personality of an individual. Identity is who you are, the way you think about yourself, the way you are viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define you. Identity is the qualities, the beliefs, the personality, the looks, the expressions you have that make a person unique. Personal identity is the concept you develop about yourself that evolves over the course of your lifetime. This includes aspects of your life you have no control over, such as the color of your skin or where you grew up, as well as the choices you make in life, such as how you spend your time and what you believe in. Personal identity allows an individual to be unique through a specific combination of their personality characteristics, their abilities, their interests, their physical attributes, their biography, where they came from. Personality and personal identity are biosocially determined, which means they're both genetically predetermined through your genes, and shaped by society and by what you go through in life. So what are some definitions, synonyms of personality? So words that mean, or of identity. Synonyms include individuality, the self, the personality, character, distinctiveness, or uniqueness. So now we can ask the question, what defines a person? A person is a being that has certain capacities or attributes, such as reason, morality, consciousness or self-consciousness, and being a part of a culturally established form of social relations, how you relate to other people. Your personal identity is at least somehow related to how you fit into various hierarchies in society, such as I am a bishop, or I am a vice president, or I am a housewife, or I'm part of the 1%. Where do you fit into the hierarchies we created in society? That also is part of your identity. The next question is, and probably the most important answer in identity is, why is it important to know your identity? It's because identity provides meaning and purpose in life. Identity evolves as we grow, even through adulthood, and without identity, it's challenging to develop a sense of fulfillment or integrity or wisdom. Identity helps us to make decisions and to know how to behave. So now, besides individual identity, what is cultural identity? It's the feeling of belonging to a group. It's part of a person's self-conception and self-perception, and it's related to our nationality, like Father says, our ethnicity, our religion, our social class, how old we are, where we live, and any type of social group that has its own distinct culture. So in simple terms, identity is related to who or what you are and where you came from. So let's talk about that. So an individual human being, you as an individual human being, you are a very minute speck in the universe, and you are a minute speck in history. Even though we tend to think of ourselves in much bigger terms, like we're really important. But in the grand scheme, we're really tiny specks in history and in time. And as a scientist, from a pure scientific point of view, I'd like to ask the question, who are we? What are we made of? And how do we fit into the universe? As I said, we're very tiny specks in the universe. So we'll look at the big picture first. What is the universe composed of? Well, the universe is composed of matter and energy. About 5% of the universe is actually normal matter, the things we learned in science class. It's protons and neutrons and atoms and things, particles. We are made up of particles. 25% of the universe is composed of what physicists call dark matter. And dark matter is unknown particles and black holes. And then 70% of the universe is composed of dark energy. And what dark energy is, if you believe in the Big Bang Theory, it's the repelling force that makes the universe expand out into nowhere. So this is part of the Big Bang Theory. So as humans, we are normal matter. We belong to a genus called Homo sapiens, and we're made up of normal matter. So quarks, this is from physics, they're subatomic particles. They're the smallest things that we know of. So the smallest component of us are quarks. Quarks make up neutrons and protons. Atoms are neutrons and protons in a nucleus surrounded by electrons. And these are atoms. And atoms and elements are the smallest things that cannot be broken down any further. So that's like a basic science lesson. Almost 99% of the human body is made up of 6 elements: oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. Less than 1% of our bodies are made up of another 5 elements: potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. But all these 11 elements are necessary for human life. So we are just normal matter as far as our bodies are concerned. When we combine atoms together, we now have molecules, which are the chemical building blocks of our body. 60% of the adult human body is made of water, the most common molecule in the body. 40% of the human body is made up of other molecules like proteins and fats and carbohydrates. So we start with quarks, we go to protons, neutrons, electrons, we go to atoms, and we go to more complex molecules, and that's what our bodies are made up of. Now, those different substances combine to create cells in our body. And the human body contains 37 trillion cells. And each cell contains billions of molecules. But when we talk about who we are, specifically, we need to look into the nucleus of the cell, which contains our DNA. So DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, is in the nucleus of every cell. It's a large molecule, if you remember from science class, that is like a double helix, which is like a ladder that's twisted on itself. You twist the ladder. And in that molecule of DNA, there are these nitrogen, there are nucleotides which are composed of nitrogen bases. And there's 4 chemicals, 4 nitrogen bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. So A, C, G, and T within the DNA molecule. And how those are arranged. So A and T always go together, G and C always go together, but in the step ladder of DNA, how many AT, 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 GC, GC, AT, GC, AT, the unique order is what is our genetic code. So it determines who you are. So in this twisted molecule of DNA, sections of it are called genes, and all these genes are hooked together in a chromosome. So that's what's in our nucleus. And using enzymes and RNA, our body takes that kind of code and creates proteins. Depending on the orders of these A and T and G and C in the molecule, certain proteins are created in our body. And those proteins, depending on the various amounts and types, make all the characteristics of a living thing. So your DNA defines who you are from the beginning, based on your hair color and your eye color, and maybe other things which we'll go into as we go along. But it is what makes you, you. So now, if we look at the human cells, each human cell contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. There's 22 autosomes and a pair of sex chromosomes, X and Y. So if you're a female, you have XX, and if you're a man, you have XY, and this determines our gender. You get this DNA from your parents, and it's hereditary material that's passed on from generation to generation. Nobody else in the world has DNA the same as you, except if you have an identical twin. You'll have the exact same DNA. So how did we find out about us? There's a thing called the Human Genome Project that took at least 15 years and took about $3 billion. We were able to map the human genome. And a lot of interesting things were found out when we did that. One is that 1 to 4% of the DNA of people, modern people that live in the Middle East, is actually the same as Neanderthal DNA, which, very interesting. Don't know what that means as far as evolution and these other concepts that have been talked about. But it is true that modern Middle Eastern people have 1 to 4% of their DNA is Neanderthal DNA. Our DNA not only determines how we look, it also helps determine how we act. Like Satan, our DNA can create fleeting pleasures to tempt people and place them in its power. So our DNA has some control over us in a certain way. Now, some things are set in stone, but the biologic process of genetic mutation can change everything. So even though, not only in your body, but in your brain. So what you end up with is not always what you started with based on mutations that occur randomly over time. So here's another very interesting question that I asked myself as I was thinking about genes. What did Jesus' DNA look like? If he got half his genetic material from his mother and half from his father, what did his DNA look like? And what if a sample of his sweat or of his blood or of his tears was somehow on a piece of wood or a cloth somewhere stowed away in Mount Athos somewhere. Could we analyze that DNA today if we had a fragment of it? And what would it show? So, very interesting question. How are we different from animals? Do animals have an identity? Does your dog have an identity? Probably not, since identity is exclusively centered in the human brain. So this is where our ancestral memory, our personal memory, and our intelligence and emotions live. The human brain is much different than an animal brain. It really is the main, where our identity is primarily seated. And our brains are proportionally much bigger than animal brains. So our human brain accounts for about 2 to 3% of our body by weight, but it uses 25% of the energy in our body is used by our brain. So even though it's a relatively small structure compared to the rest of our body, it uses 25% of our body's energy. Our mental and emotional world, how we deal with the world, is governed by biochemical mechanisms in our brain, the human brain that's been developed over time, by millions of years of evolution, or possibly by God himself. How did the combination of nerves and neurons and synapses and substances like serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin come into being? Each human brain has almost 100 trillion connections or synapses. Could the human brain really have arisen out of evolution? Because as scientists, we know everything in nature goes toward decay and goes toward randomness. Nothing in the physical world becomes more and more complex over time. It just doesn't happen unless you postulate that there's something called a creation particle or a God particle, but nobody's found that yet. So how did the human brain develop unless somehow it was in the hands of God? How does the creation of individual personal memories in our brain affect our identity? Is there such a thing as inherited memories, ancestral memories, which are somehow embedded in our DNA? Could we possibly be unique individuals without memory? The answers to these questions are also very difficult, and they're primarily a mystery, because even how memories are created in the brain, there's some theories how it happens. Nobody really knows how it happens. The next question is, how do we deal with this nature versus nurture argument with identity? How much of who we are, our identity, is hardwired into us from birth in our genes and cannot be changed? How much is related to our experiences and how we've been influenced by other people and events in our life, such as how our parents raised us, how we were influenced by people, whether we experienced abuse or traumatic events in our life? How does that influence who we are and influence our identity? And how does our gender affect our identity, or what we consider to be our identity? Let's just take, I think Father mentioned this also, about men tend to identify with their jobs, whereas women identify usually with their relationships. So you ask a man, who are you? And he'll say, I'm a lawyer, or I'm a doctor, or I'm a priest. You ask a woman and she'll say, I'm so-and-so's wife, or I'm so-and-so's mother. So women identify more with relationships, men identify with their career, with their job. So our gender also affects who we think we are. Today it seems we can pick and choose our identity. Do you identify as a male? Do you identify as a female? Do you identify as something else? Is that really how it's supposed to be? You can even now identify with your age. There's a Dutchman in the Netherlands who recently brought a case to court and says, I want to identify as 49 years old. They go, but you're 69 years old. And he goes, but I want to identify as 49 because it's much easier to get a job if I'm 49 than when I'm 69. So people now are deciding what age to identify with. So it's all very interesting. So now, as an individual human being, where do you fit into the big picture? So most of the information I'm going to talk about now is from a very, very interesting book I just read, which was very timely, right before this seminar. It's called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. And this was a New York Times bestseller written by an Israeli history professor based in Jerusalem, Yuval Noah Harari. And He postulates that there's a timeline of history which will help to put you and me and all human beings into perspective. Also, we know our history and our collective memory, our unconscious memories we may inherit from our ancestors, have almost certainly helped to shape who we are. So, what is the history of the universe and how do we fit into it? So matter and energy and time and space appear about 13.5 billion years ago when the Big Bang happens, if you believe in that. And it's the beginnings of physics and the beginnings of chemistry. Earth is formed 4.5 billion years ago. Organisms formed 3.8 billion years ago, and this is the beginning of biology, the study of living things. The first animals who were similar to us, the species Homo, appear in Africa 2.5 million years ago. And it's postulated by certain scientists that initially there were actually 6 or 7 different species of humans beside Homo sapiens that existed. And these species were related to the family of the great apes. The daily usage of fire starts 300,000 years ago, setting humans apart, different from animals, because now we could cook food. And this gave us a major historical advantage over animals. Homo sapiens, our species, which means wise man, appears in East Africa about 200,000 years ago. 70,000 years ago, we have the cognitive revolution, which something happens in the human brain where now languages emerge, scripts, history, abstract thinking, the creation of fiction, and the creation of culture. So this is about 70,000 years ago. There's new ways of thinking and new ways of communicating and change social behaviors. This is when we first started to develop common legends, common myths, stories, religions, and gods. It allowed for the development of what we call imagined realities, which are abstract concepts that animals don't have. So we make our own realities through different ways of thinking. During this time, the humans, Homo sapiens, transmitted larger quantities of information about the world, about social relationships, and about things that do not really exist in physical reality. We started thinking beyond ourselves and beyond the physical world. The question is, did genetic mutations happen in the human brain to allow these abilities to develop? Or somehow did God put this ability in the human brain? But by the end of this era, 70,000 years ago, we're no longer just limited by our biology. We start thinking beyond ourselves and beyond the natural world, and we've come up with things like religions. Now, about 13,000 years ago, the last of those 6 or 7 other human species that were around became extinct. It was Homo floresiensis, and Homo sapiens was the only human species left on Earth. The agricultural revolution happened 12,000 years ago when we started to domesticate plants and animals, and we developed permanent settlements like cities and villages and towns. About 5,000 years ago, the first kingdoms arose, and we had written communication and money was developed. 500 years ago, we had the scientific revolution. And now 200 years ago, we have the Industrial Revolution, leading to new ways to convert energy to produce goods. And we liberated human beings from totally being dependent on the natural world. We could create things. So all these things in the last 200 years, really, of this 13.5 billion year history, we're living kind of in this era, which is a tiny speck in history. So now the question is, where are we headed in the future? What will our identity be as we move on, as the world moves on and progresses? But we'll talk about that later. In light of this timeline of history, I came up with another question. Did God create human beings in a supernatural way, as described in the book of Genesis? Or did God allow the natural process of evolution and natural selection, described by Darwin, to proceed under his direction, which led to the creation of the unique species known as Homo sapiens? Interesting question. So we have evolved from hunter-gatherers to farmers to technical wizards who can now make nuclear weapons, and potentially we're going to colonize other planets in the future. Will we eventually be the animal that became a god? So this is something we have to ask. Where are we going in the future? As we develop more complex social structures, are we better off or not? When humans were hunter-gatherers, we had better nutrition, we had less diseases, we had no wars. All we did, we existed in the forest, we picked fruit off trees, we had small bands of people who lived together, but we didn't have all these modern diseases, and we didn't have wars back then. With the agricultural revolution, when people decided to stake their claim on plots of land, that these are my fields, we suddenly had more wars and more violence. With the Industrial Revolution, human beings became mindless workers in systems such as capitalism and communism. We were no longer just carefree hunter-gatherers, we were now mindless robot workers making goods for different systems in history. Our ancestors could not possibly have fathomed or predicted the consequences of this progress in human history. So complex human societies require the human brain to create these imagined hierarchies that do not exist in nature, such as the Indian caste system or the divine right of kings, how we decided to rule ourselves. A lot of these things were based on gender or based on race, and they helped to create empires and promoted trade and led to the development of various religions and forms of money. Unfortunately, these imagined hierarchies that we created also led to discrimination, to injustice, to a lot of bad things that happened in the world. So traditional religions hold that there's a superhuman order focused on God or supernatural entities, which is not the product of the human brain, not the product of human whims and human agreements. These religions establish norms and values that we consider binding, which lead to social and political order. The new humanistic religions, on the other hand, worship humanity. They worship the human brain. They worship us. Now, with the collapse of the family and traditional communities, are we creating new imagined communities that will replace them? What will replace these things? How will these things affect our identity and who we really are? And another interesting question, again related to religion, how is our identity related to our soul? Are they the same? Are they tied together? Where does the soul live? In the human brain? In the human body? In the nucleus of our cells? What is the human soul and how is it related to identity? So now I want to quote that this book, Sapiens, has some very, very interesting thoughts in it. I don't agree with a lot of it, but some of it really, really makes you think. So I want to read a quote from the book, Sapiens. The last 500 years have witnessed a breathtaking series of revolutions. The earth has been united into a single ecological and historical sphere. The economy has grown exponentially, and humankind today enjoys the kind of wealth that used to be the stuff of fairy tales. Science and the Industrial Revolution have given humankind superhuman power and practically limitless energy. The social order has been completely transformed, as have politics, daily life, and human psychology. But are we happier? Are we more content? Do we have meaning to our lives? Interesting. Another quote. The pursuit of an easier life resulted in much hardship, and not for the last time. It happens to us today. How many young college graduates have taken demanding jobs in high-powered firms, vowing that they will work hard to earn money that will enable them to retire and pursue their real interests when they're 35? But by the time they reach that age, they have mortgages, children to school, houses in the suburbs that necessitate at least 2 cars per family, and a sense that life is not worth living without really good wine and expensive holidays abroad. What are they supposed to do, go back to digging roots? No, they double their efforts and keep slaving away. Luxuries tend to become necessities and spawn new obligations. Humanity's search for an easier life released immense forces of change that transformed the world in ways nobody envisioned or even wanted. So the question is, are we happy? Happiness, which is like a feeling of well-being, tends to be found in community, in religion, and in a bond with nature. Happiness occurs when we have no expectations and therefore no disappointments. And in Buddhism, they say no cravings. And in Orthodox Christianity, we say to dissociate from the passions, where we have no expectations and we're never disappointed because we're not expecting to have these things fulfilled in our lives. The question is, as history moves on and we adopt intelligent design and artificial intelligence, will we be replaced by superhumans that we help to create through genetic engineering? The question is this really where we want to go? Or will we become the new gods who create our own perfect descendants? Or will we create computer programs that will be immortal and eventually destroy us, like that computer HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey? Very interesting questions, all related to who we are individually and who we are as human beings. And the final quote from the book, which I thought was very interesting: 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was still an insignificant animal minding its own business in a corner of Africa. In the following millennia, it transformed itself into the master of the entire planet and the terror of the ecosystem. Today, it stands on the verge of becoming a god, poised to acquire not only eternal youth, but also the divine abilities of creation and destruction. Unfortunately, the sapiens regime on Earth has so far produced little that we can be proud of. We have mastered our surroundings, increased our food production, built cities, established empires, and created far-flung trade networks. But did we decrease the amount of suffering in the world? Time and again, massive increases in human power did not necessarily improve the well-being of individual sapiens, and usually caused immense misery to other animals. In the last few decades, we have made some real progress as far as the human condition is concerned, with the reduction of famine, plague, and war. Yet the situation of other animals is deteriorating more rapidly than ever before, and the improvement in the lot of humanity is too recent and fragile to be certain. Moreover, despite the astonishing things that humans are capable of doing, we remain unsure of our goals, and we seem to be as disconnected as ever. We have advanced from canoes to galleys to steamships and now to space shuttles, but nobody knows where they're going. We are more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea what to do with all that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever. Self-made gods with only the laws of physics to keep us company, we are accountable to no one. We are consequently wreaking havoc on our fellow animals and on the surrounding ecosystem, seeking little more than our own comfort and amusement, and yet never finding satisfaction. Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? So in the end, I'll leave us with a final question. Who are we, and what have we really become?